Do you have one glute that seems more underdeveloped or doesn't quite activate as well as the other one? In this video, I'm going to show you why that happens and what you can do to fix it. There's two main reasons why this can happen. The first is that the glute is in too short of a position. It's already in a relatively contracted position and it can't properly elongate, which is very important if you want it to properly activate. The second is that the glute is already in too much of an elongated position and it can't properly contract and close the space off on the backside of the pelvis to fully work. Both of these things can be big limiters as to why that glute doesn't grow or activate as well as the other one. Let's start with the first one, in the case where the glute is already too shortened and it can't properly elongate, which may be surprising to hear that this is probably the more common reason rather than a glute that is too elongated and can't shorten. Let me explain why. In order for a muscle to properly contract, it needs to come from a relatively elongated position. This elongated position provides leverage for the glute to properly contract and move into that shortened position. A muscle cannot shorten if it's already started in a shortened position. The glutes create hip extension, meaning they stand us up from a position of hip bend, but they also create external rotation. So they close off the back space of the pelvis like this and turn the femur into this position right here. So in order for that glute to contract, we need to come from a place of relative amounts of hip bend and hip internal rotation like this. So people with this problem usually have an issue with getting into a position of hip flexion and hip internal rotation to stretch out the glute to then give it leverage to contract and stand us up into hip extension and external rotation. So naturally what you'll see with these people, and you can test this on yourself to see if you're likely one of these people, is you'll have a limitation in your hip internal rotation, but also a limitation in your straight leg raise measurement. Usually hip internal rotation will be less than about 30 degrees and their straight leg raise will be almost certainly less than about 60 to 70 degrees, but sometimes even less than 45 degrees. Also, these people tend to have a really hard time moving into what we call a hip hinge, which is more of like that deadlift position where they're pushing their hips back, because that requires a lot of hip flexion and hip internal rotation as well. So if this is you, here's a couple of things that you can do to instantly improve your ability to create better length on the backside of the pelvis and better use your glute as you move into hip flexion and internal rotation. A really easy way to start to do that is just to get about 8 to 12 inches of elevation where your whole foot can be flat and something directly next to your side that you can hold on to gently. Now bend the knee and get really heavy on your foot right here, keeping the whole foot flat. Now you want to stay tall, exhale a little bit to feel the ribs come down, but don't lose height in your skeleton as you do that. Now hinge at your hips, push your butt back a little bit, keeping a very slight knee bend, keeping your chest up, and you're going to feel a little stretch in the back side of your hip at some point, probably right around right here. Once you feel a little stretch, that's all you need. You don't need to go too deep into it. Keeping your eyes up, very slowly lower yourself, maintaining that same torso angle, and you'll feel more of a stretch as you very lightly tap your foot right there on the ground, coming up. Controlling that, keeping the torso angle the exact same. Now, as you do that more and more, you're going to feel your glute work more and more. Just gain competency in this position and get really good at it. And if you want to feel a little bit more glute, you want to make sure that your zipper line is very slightly turned towards that stance leg foot. So from a straight on view, it'll look like your zipper line is turning like this, but make sure the knee isn't coming out with you as you do that. Keep the knee going slightly in, but turn your zipper towards that side. You might feel a little inner thigh engaged, but that's okay. That's going to help you get more glute elongation because this turn is giving you more hip internal rotation. And once you get better at it, just slowly start to add a little bit more height, just a couple inches at a time, just like this. And then you can work yourself deeper into that hip flexion and internal rotation, keeping that slight hinge. You can take that same concept and apply it to something like a bent over split squat. So start in the bottom position, bottom knee underneath the hip, and then this leg about yay out in front of you, and then slowly hinge into it very subtly until you feel a little stretch on the back side of the front hip. Grab a little weight in front of you, and then go through it, maintaining that slight forward torso lean the entire time. You're really gonna feel this front leg glute work really hard if you can keep heavy over this foot. If you want more exercises or just a more comprehensive approach that can be individualized to addressing common body asymmetries, postural issues, movement issues, and many types of pain, then check out my Beginner Body Restoration Program. It's designed for anyone to be able to do, requires minimal time per day, and it's a really good all-in-one program for a lot of these issues. So check it out down below in the description if you want to learn more. Now that brings us to the second problem. And the second problem is that glute is starting in too much of an elongated position, and this is commonly what people think of when they think a muscle can't contract very well, is it can't actually move into that shortened position. Well, this could be the case, and that glute can't properly create hip external rotation and hip extension. So typically what we see in these cases where you have a smaller and weaker glute on one side, and this is the problem on that side. The pelvis is turned towards that side. Because when a pelvis is turned towards a given side in our resting posture or just has a bias of turning towards one side more than the other, then that side, the side that it's better turning towards, is internally rotated. And we don't have the ability as effectively as the other side to use the glute to push us away from that side and get us turning towards the other side. Because these people struggle to get a contraction of the glute and move into a position of hip extension and external rotation, these people will be limited relative to the other side in terms of their hip external rotation. You're usually going to see that is worse on this side. Also, they're going to have more limited hip abduction. That's usually going to be limited less than about 30 degrees. And also, it's going to be worse than the other side. So what we typically need to do in these situations is promote a better push of the glute from one side to the other. And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. Let me show you what I mean. If my pelvis was turned towards the right side, watch what happens with my feet. My weight would be turned towards more of the outside of my right foot. So what I need to learn how to do is teach the inside edge of my foot to work with my glute to help push me back over to the left side more effectively. And that will really help me on exercises, creating that connection between that inside edge of the foot arch on that side of my pelvis is turned towards and the glute together. What we're gonna do is get in a side lying position where we have our feet against the wall and a 90-degree bend at both our knees and our hips. Now, we want to make sure that we have a couple of things that are going to help optimize the setup and execution of this. The first is a pillow double folded in half. So that way our head is just ever so slightly side bent towards the ceiling right there, just a little bit. It should allow our neck to stay 100% relaxed the entire time we're doing this exercise. The other thing is we have a little rolled up yoga mat, or it could be a beach or a shower towel rolled up, or it can be some hand towels rolled up too. And that is just underneath the lowest part of the rib cage, but the hip is still flat on the floor. Okay. The last thing is a band around the knees and also a couple of books stacked up, maybe 2 to 3 inches tall, so that way we have our knees starting just below the height of our feet right there. Okay, so first thing Jacob's gonna do is make sure he has no tension in his body. He wants to make sure he's totally relaxed. Are you there?
Yes.
Great. Okay, now I want Jacob to take a nice full sighing exhale through his mouth for about 5 or even more seconds. And at the end of that exhale, big open mouth sigh, he's gonna feel his rib cage come down. And at the end of that exhale, he's gonna feel like his ribs are down and in. That's good. It's almost like he's doing a little posterior pelvic tilt, but he's not trying to squeeze anything in his hips. It's just like he's bringing his rib cage down a little bit. Now, Jacob is going to tuck his bottom side shoulder underneath him. So let's show him what that looks like. It's not anything crazy. It's just dropping the shoulder a little lower, keeping your arm in basically the same place. Let's do that one more time, Jacob, so they see what that looks like right there. Start there. Now just a subtle tuck underneath you. What that's going to allow him to do is, while he's keeping his ribcage down, which he achieved in the first step of this, is that's gonna allow him to slightly lift away from these towels right here, or this yoga mat, whatever he's using. And that's going to give him engagement of his side abs on the bottom side. We just wanna make sure that as Jacob creates that little tunnel down there, he's not flaring or arching his back or extending his ribcage like that. He's gotta keep those ribs down and in, just like we did at the beginning of this exercise. So what should happen is that he should feel just his downside side abs engaged. His neck should still be relaxed. Do you feel that, Jacob?
Yes. Good. If he didn't, then one cue that could be helpful is he could reach this top hip away from him. That's another cue that can achieve the same thing, might be more helpful for some people. So can we show him what that looks like? If you were to reach this hip away from you, perfect, just like that, that's the idea. Okay, so he's got his side abs engaged, his ribs tucked in a little bit. Now he's going to feel some important foot contacts on that wall, particularly the inner heel of this top foot and the base of his big toe. Without losing the outside foot, he wants to keep those things flat on the wall. Bottom side foot should just remain in contact with the wall. Don't lose that heel. Now, feeling those foot contacts on the wall, Jacob is going to first slide his knee as far as he can forward without losing that tunnel in his left abs or his right inner heel contact on that wall. And then he's gonna focus on keeping those things again and slightly lifting his knee without ever losing that right foot arch on the wall or feeling like he's gonna side bend here. We don't want that. So that's why we gotta maintain that little tunnel on the left side there. And as he does that, Jacob is going to feel his right lower butt cheek muscle engage. Not as much the outside of his hip, more so the lower part of his glute max right here. And now Jacob's gonna breathe in through his nose, out through his mouth. What I want Jacob to focus on is like he's trying to develop a relationship between his right glute and his right foot arch working together. That's what we're trying to educate our body to do here. So he's gonna just hold this position, nice relaxed inhales and exhales. He should never, ever, ever feel his neck or low back engage. So do you feel either of those things, Jacob? Are the only two muscles you feel in your entire body your left abs and your right low butt cheek?
Yes.
Perfect. Then he's doing it right. That's how you know you're having success in this exercise. Top side glute, bottom side side abs, and that is it. The biggest mistake I see in this exercise has to do with the setup. People start with their feet too far back like this or way too far forward, and they can't get the effective glute activation because they can't get that knee going over those toes in a way where they can keep the foot contact. So we gotta get and make sure we have that 90-degree angle right here. That is so important.
After you do an exercise like that first prep activity, you then want to translate being able to load the ability to push away from that side and use your glute more effectively. But we also got to get the foot to connect with the ground better. So a way that we can do that and get better foot contacts and the ability to push is through a wedge setup like this. So we can place a little wedge on our forefoot, slanted down, so that way our big toe can make better contact with the ground. This is going to make it easier for you to connect with the ground to push. So then you can grab a weight in the same side of the leg that's forward. Now, this is depending on you as an individual, what's going to work best for you. Some people can be more upright and they can go through that split squat and they can just feel really heavy on this leg. Other people might benefit from, like we did before, and a little bit more of a slightly hinged forward torso to feel heavier right here on this leg. Just depends what feels best for you. And honestly, you don't even have to use a weight. Just get used to feeling your weight heavy on that foot and get used to making sure that you can connect that inside edge of your foot and the connection on the wedge with your big toe to your glute working. I'd recommend doing these exercises multiple times per week, probably somewhere between 3 to 6 times per week on that side of the weaker glute. Don't forget to train the other side still, but you might need to do more volume and frequency on that side of the weaker and smaller glute to help catch it up a little bit.